Welcome. This is one of the strangest and most unsettling stories quietly. Recorded in the early history of Natchez, Mississippi. It is a story of a vanished family, a clever servant, and a community that chose not to see what was happening right in front of them. Before we begin, I want you to do something. Leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. Also, note the time when this story reaches you. These accounts have a strange way of traveling far and wide, and it is always interesting to know where people hear them. It was the morning of July 11th, 1841. The sun had just begun to rise over the Mississippi River, its light reflected off the water, sparkling through the morning mist. The air was heavy with summer heat. Even the birds seemed sluggish in the thick air. Along a narrow dirt road that ran along the western edge of the Mississippi River, just beyond the outskirts of the Natchez settlement, a man was walking. His name was Elias Monroe. He was a river trader, a man who traveled up and down the Mississippi, buying and selling goods and always keeping an eye out for opportunity. On this morning, however, Monroe's attention was drawn to something far more unusual than any trade. There, stuck in the mud of the riverbank, was an abandoned carriage. Its wheels were half sunk, as though it had been left in a hurry. One wheel was buried deep in the soft, wet mud. Monroe slowed his pace. He looked carefully at the carriage. He could see that the horses were gone. The harness lay on the ground nearby. No tracks indicated where the carriage had gone. No footprints, except for his own, disturbed the mud. Monroe approached cautiously. He opened the carriage door. Inside there was no blood, no bodies. Nothing at all that suggested violence. What he did find was strange enough. A single woman's glove, a leather-bound account book, with every page left blank, and a silver pendant. But the pendant contained no photograph, no inscription. It was as if it had been prepared for someone but never used. On the side of the carriage, Monroe saw the crest of the Hollis estate, a large and prosperous cotton plantation located roughly 6 miles east of Natchez. Monroe's stomach turned slightly. Something about this scene felt wrong. Carriages were rarely abandoned. They were valuable. They were not left in the mud without reason. By midday, Monroe had reported his discovery to the local constable, Edwin Price. The constable quickly noted something strange. No member of the Hollis household had been seen in Natchez for nearly a month. Normally, plantation families could be absent during harvest or planting seasons, but the Hollis family was unusual. Charles Hollis, the head of the family, was known for one strict habit. He visited the Planters' Bank of Natchez every Monday, without fail. This habit was rigid. Everyone in town knew it. Bank ledgers later confirmed what the constable suspected. Charles Hollis had missed 4 consecutive visits. Something was very wrong. That same afternoon, Constable Price sent 2 deputies to the Hollis plantation. They rode quickly, aware that the situation might be urgent. When they arrived, the plantation looked normal at first glance. The cotton fields were full of workers. The house servants were busy with their chores. Meals were being prepared, rooms were clean, and the beds were made. It looked as if the Hollis family were simply elsewhere on the property, but they were not there. The deputies searched carefully. They checked the main house. Charles Hollis, age 49, was nowhere to be found. His wife, Margaret, age 45, was missing. Their 3 children, Edward, 24, Louisa, 21, and Henry, 19, were also gone. The only person who seemed unusual was Celeste Fontaine, a house servant, around 32 years old. Other servants reported that when she was not working, she would sit in the front parlor motionless for hours at a time. No one knew why. When questioned, all the enslaved people gave the same answer, almost word for word. Master Hollis has gone to visit family upriver. He will return before harvest. But Charles Hollis had no family upriver. Parish records confirmed he had no living siblings at all. Over the next few weeks, a quiet investigation began. Neighboring plantation owners were asked questions. Everyone knew the Hollis family was gone. Yet strangely, no one seemed worried. If pressed, they would grow uncomfortable and change the subject quickly. In August 1841, Judge Nathaniel Crow, a longtime associate of Charles Hollis, began a more formal investigation. In private notes later recovered, Crow wrote, "It is not merely that the family has vanished. It is that no one appears willing to acknowledge the absence itself." By early September, the plantation continued its operations as usual. Cotton was harvested. Goods were sold. Money was deposited in the Hollis account. Each transaction had a signature that matched Charles Hollis's handwriting, yet the man himself was never seen again. During this time, reports about Celeste Fontaine began to change. House servants claimed she had moved into the master bedroom. She began wearing Margaret Hollis's dresses and jewelry. More disturbing, she started giving orders using Margaret's voice. Her tone, phrases, and mannerisms were reproduced perfectly. Those who received the orders obeyed without question. Judge Crow recorded testimony from a field worker named Jonah, who had tried to flee the plantation in October. Before being returned, Jonah said, "There ain't no Hollises no more." Miss Celeste says there never was. Jonah was returned. He was never seen again. What followed became one of the most quietly buried and disturbing episodes in Mississippi's antebellum history. As September moved forward, the Hollis plantation remained strangely normal on the surface. The cotton fields were busy. Workers bent low, picking cotton in the heat, their hands raw and their clothes damp with sweat. Birds sang and the river murmured in the distance, carrying the sound of distant steamboats. Yet the absence of the Hollis family weighed on the property like a heavy shadow. The deputies who first came to the plantation returned occasionally, bringing reports to Constable Price and Judge Crow. They noted again and again that everything seemed routine. Meals were prepared on time. The servants followed their duties faithfully. Rooms were cleaned. Livestock were fed. Nothing was missing. But there was one thing they could not ignore: Celeste Fontaine. She moved differently now. Her posture had changed. She walked as though she owned the house, even though she had been only a servant weeks before. Her eyes were sharp, scanning every room and every corner. Sometimes she would pause, listening to voices that no one else seemed to hear. Other times, she would laugh quietly to herself, a soft sound that made even the bravest workers uneasy. Several servants whispered among themselves about her. They said that at night, after everyone had gone to bed, she would sit in the master bedroom, talking quietly as if speaking to someone invisible. Her words were sometimes sharp, sometimes gentle, always commanding. Those who overheard her felt a strange mix of fear and respect. Meanwhile, Judge Crow was growing more concerned. He had begun keeping a detailed journal, recording every report and testimony. He noted how the whole community acted as though the Hollis family had simply vanished, without consequence. Neighbors offered explanations, but none made sense. Some said the family had moved upriver, though no one could confirm it. Others suggested they were visiting relatives in distant towns. But each explanation fell apart under scrutiny. Crow wrote in his journal, "The plantation operates as if nothing is wrong, yet something is deeply wrong. There is a silence here that feels deliberate, as though the land itself conspires to hide the truth." The first deputies described Celeste's influence in the house. She had begun wearing the master's and mistress's clothing. But it was not just the clothing that startled the workers. It was her voice, her gestures, her authority. When she spoke as Margaret Hollis, she gave instructions, and everyone obeyed. Even those who had known Margaret personally said Celeste's imitation was frighteningly accurate. Jonah, the field worker who tried to escape, had been the first to see the truth clearly. When he returned, trembling, he whispered that the Hollises were gone, replaced by Celeste's will. After that, he disappeared entirely. Some said he had run away a second time. Others feared something worse. In the weeks that followed, small but strange events began to multiply. Animals behaved oddly. Horses refused to leave their stalls, neighing and stamping. Chickens gathered silently in the corners of the yard, their feathers ruffled. Dogs growled without cause. The cotton fields, once full of chatter, now echoed with quiet murmurs. Workers spoke less, their voices lower. Some claimed they could hear Celeste speaking even when she was in another room. The deputies began documenting these details. They described how the Hollis household seemed to follow its old rhythm despite the total absence of its members. Every action, from cooking to cleaning, occurred at exactly the time it had before, and yet the person guiding it now was not the Hollises, but Celeste Fontaine. Judge Crow grew more disturbed by the community's reaction, or lack of it. Plantation owners nearby were aware of the situation, but none intervened. They nodded politely, changed the subject, or offered vague excuses. Crow wrote, "It is as though no one wishes to acknowledge the truth. Everyone acts as if the plantation operates normally, yet the truth is far from normal." By late September, the deputies had begun spending nights at the plantation. They claimed they heard footsteps in hallways where no one walked. Doors opened and closed on their own. Lights flickered without cause. And always, the presence of Celeste Fontaine was in the background, silent at times, commanding at others. Workers began to whisper rumors among themselves. Some said Celeste had learned secrets from Margaret Hollis. Others believed she had a plan, though no one dared say it aloud. Some older servants, who had worked for generations in the household, hinted that they had seen this kind of transformation before, though never so complete. Celeste's influence continued to grow. She began sitting in the parlor during the day, seemingly in deep thought. Guests who came to the plantation for business or trade reported that she spoke with authority. She gave instructions on cotton shipments, household orders, and even minor financial matters. Those who spoke with her said her eyes seemed to know more than she should. Meanwhile, Judge Crow wrote to a friend in another parish, "I fear this is not simply a matter of absent masters. Something far greater and more disturbing has taken their place. The house is alive with her presence, and yet no one seems to resist. I have never seen such obedience, nor such fear mingled with it." The deputies' reports grew more urgent. They described a scene where the plantation was fully functional, yet no Hollises were present. Cotton was harvested and packed. Bills were written and signed. Deliveries went out on schedule, and all instructions came from Celeste Fontaine. By October, the plantation had entered a state that could only be described as eerily normal. To a casual observer, it appeared that the Hollis family was simply elsewhere. But those who looked closer, like Judge Crow and the deputies, knew that something impossible was happening. Even the enslaved workers began to speak of Celeste in hushed tones, often using phrases like, "Miss Celeste runs the house now. She knows everything, sees everything. There ain't no Hollises no more." Their words, though whispered, carried the weight of truth, and the truth, hidden in plain sight, terrified everyone who recognized it. By early October 1841, the Hollis plantation had taken on a strange new rhythm. To any passerby, the estate seemed fully alive. The fields were bright with cotton, the barns were orderly, and the house appeared perfectly maintained. The scent of baking bread and cooked meals drifted from the kitchen. Yet beneath this normal surface, something unnatural was unfolding. The deputies, who now spent most nights on the property, began to notice patterns that made no sense. Doors that had been locked during the day were found open at night. Footsteps echoed down empty hallways. Chairs were moved slightly from where they had been placed. Candles burned low even when untouched. And everywhere, the presence of Celeste Fontaine was unmistakable. She moved silently, her shadow gliding along the walls like a ghost. Sometimes she would appear in rooms without warning, standing perfectly still. Other times she would speak softly, her voice imitating Margaret Hollis, so exactly that it caused confusion among the workers. A field hand would hear her calling them from the parlor, only to find the mistress had never left her room. Even the most skeptical deputies began to doubt their own senses. One evening, Deputy Harris wrote in his report, "I swear I saw Miss Celeste standing in the front parlor, yet minutes later she was outside, tending to the livestock. No doors opened, no stairs creaked. It is as if the air itself carries her from place to place." Workers began reporting other strange happenings. Some said they could hear whispers in the fields, voices speaking in tones that mimicked their masters. Others claimed they had seen Celeste in two places at once, one in the main house, another in the kitchen. Animals also behaved strangely. Horses refused to leave the stables. Chickens gathered silently in corners. Dogs growled at empty doorways. Yet despite all this, the plantation continued to function perfectly. Cotton was harvested on time. Orders were prepared and sent. Bills were written and signed with Charles Hollis's signature. The deputies could not explain it. Small disappearances began to happen. Jonah, the field worker who had attempted to flee, vanished after his return. Other workers were noticed missing, though no record was ever made. Some whispered that Celeste had ways of enforcing her authority that were beyond comprehension. Judge Crow recorded these events with growing unease. He noted that the plantation seemed to operate under a new law, one dictated by Celeste Fontaine. Every action, from cooking meals to managing finances, came under her control. No one disobeyed, even when it defied common sense. Visitors were also affected. Merchants who came to buy cotton reported feeling an invisible pressure, as though the house itself demanded obedience. They wrote of seeing Celeste issuing instructions while seated quietly. Her eyes piercing, her tone calm yet absolute. Even the most confident men left with a sense of fear and awe. At night, the estate grew quieter, almost unnaturally so. Windows reflected shadows that did not match any known shape. Steps were heard in hallways that had no stairs. Whispers floated through the air, sometimes repeating workers' own words back to them. It was during one such night that Deputy Harris reported seeing Celeste standing in the master bedroom, her back to him, speaking softly in Margaret Hollis's voice. "Go to sleep. All is well. The house is ours now," she said. The deputy froze, unable to respond. When he finally blinked, she was gone. Even among the enslaved workers, fear mixed with reverence. They spoke of Celeste Fontaine in hushed tones, using phrases like, "She runs the house now. She knows everything, sees everything. We obey her, for there is no other choice." Some older servants hinted that they had seen similar transformations in the past, though never so complete. One, an elderly woman named Clara, whispered that the house itself seemed to bend to Celeste's will. Strange items began appearing in the house. A mirror in the parlor showed reflections that did not match reality. Shadows moved independently. A silver locket, thought lost weeks before, reappeared on a table, though no one had placed it there. Notes were found in Charles Hollis's handwriting, giving instructions that mirrored Celeste's own. Judge Crow became increasingly concerned. He wrote in his journal, "This is not simply the absence of a family. This is the creation of a new order, one that follows no known law, enforced by a woman who should not have such power. The plantation obeys her as if enchanted. Attempts to question Celeste directly were dangerous. She spoke with calm authority, her tone like Margaret Hollis, yet sharper, colder. Any defiance was met with silence and a stare that left workers trembling. By October's end, it was clear to all observers that Celeste Fontaine had replaced the Hollis family entirely. Letters from neighboring plantations, written quietly and secretly, indicated that rumors were spreading, yet no one dared investigate further. There was a collective agreement to look away, to pretend everything was normal. Those who spoke too loudly disappeared or were silenced. In mid-October, an incident occurred that would later be cited as the most chilling evidence of Celeste's control. A young boy, Henry, not yet 10, had wandered into the garden alone. Celeste appeared quietly behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. She whispered something in a tone exactly like Margaret Hollis, and the boy ran back inside without a sound, obeying every instruction she had given. The deputies and Judge Crow realized that this was no ordinary case of missing masters or a strange servant. Something unnatural, something almost impossible was taking place. The plantation was alive, but alive under Celeste Fontaine's singular will. By the end of October, the story had spread quietly. Workers told new arrivals to obey Miss Celeste, to never question her, and to act as if the Hollis family were still present. Any attempt to resist ended in disappearance or fear. The plantation operated like a machine, precise, orderly, yet ruled by a woman who was not meant to have such control. Judge Crow wrote in his final October entry, "The plantation is no longer a home. It is a place of shadows and obedience. Miss Celeste Fontaine has become its master in every sense. No one can see the truth, and perhaps no one wishes to. The Hollis Fontaine case was no longer merely mysterious. It had become a story of fear, obedience, and impossible control, a quiet horror that would go unnoticed by the outside world for decades." By November 1841, the Hollis plantation had settled into a new, strange order. The fields continued to be worked, the cotton harvested on schedule, and the house seemed perfectly normal to anyone who passed by. Yet those who lived there knew something was deeply wrong. Celeste Fontaine had become the center of everything. She moved with a quiet authority that no one dared question. She wore Margaret Hollis's dresses, spoke in her voice, and even mimicked her expressions and gestures. Those who disobeyed her instructions vanished. Some left the plantation quietly and were never seen again. Others simply disappeared within the house. Workers began to notice other strange events. At night, whispers floated through the hallways, repeating phrases they had spoken during the day. Shadows moved along the walls even when no candles burned. A mirror in the parlor reflected Celeste standing in the room, even when she was not there. Doors would close and lock on their own. Objects like keys, letters, and jewelry appeared in places they had never been. Even animals behaved strangely. Horses refused to leave the stables. Chickens gathered silently in corners. Dogs growled at invisible figures in the hallways. One night, a horse broke free of its harness, only to stop in the middle of the field, staring at the main house as if it recognized something unnatural inside. Judge Crow, who had been observing the plantation from a distance, wrote in his journal, "The house is alive, but alive under her will. Miss Celeste Fontaine commands obedience from everything that moves. I fear the law has no power here and reason has no place." By December, Celeste had begun taking more control over the plantation's operations. She issued orders to the field workers, the kitchen staff, and even the overseers. Her voice was calm, yet absolute. The deputies reported that even the ledgers bore instructions in Charles Hollis's hand, but it was Celeste directing the entries. Small incidents of defiance were met with terrifying results. One field worker, Thomas, tried to hide a basket of cotton for himself. The next day, he was found wandering near the riverbank, speechless and trembling, unable to recall how he got there. Others whispered that Celeste could see through their minds, knowing every thought before it was spoken. Neighbors began to notice unusual patterns too. Some reported seeing Celeste walking along the river, carrying items that seemed to vanish into thin air. Merchants and traders felt a strange pressure when they entered the house, as if invisible eyes followed their every move. Despite this, the plantation continued to generate income. Cotton was sold, bills were paid, orders were delivered on time. To the outside world, everything seemed normal. Yet inside, the plantation had become a realm ruled by a single mysterious woman. By early 1842, Celeste's influence extended beyond the plantation. Former workers who had left reported seeing her in nearby towns, giving advice, making trades, or simply appearing where no one expected her. Her reputation grew quietly, spoken of in hushed tones. Madame Fontaine knows everything. Do not cross her. She sees all. She is no ordinary woman. We obey her because there is no choice. Letters sent to Judge Crow indicated that the Hollis family had effectively ceased to exist. Neighbors noticed that no one claimed to know their whereabouts. Those who asked questions were met with cold indifference or subtle threats. It was as if a collective agreement had formed. No one would speak of the missing Hollises. Workers described the house as haunted yet alive. Meals would appear as if prepared by invisible hands. Beds were made without anyone in the room. Objects moved on their own, and always Celeste's presence was felt, whether seen or not. By late 1842, the story of Celeste Fontaine had begun to fade from public view, but it persisted among those who had lived through it. She had created a new reality, one in which the Hollis family no longer existed, and in which she controlled everything. This transformation set the stage for the next chapter in the story. Decades later, after the Civil War, the same woman, or someone who had assumed her identity, would reappear as Adelaide White, a respected landowner who bridged the worlds of former masters and freed people. The mystery of Celeste Fontaine's rise, her disappearance of the Hollis family, and the obedience of everyone around her would remain a quiet horror, quietly recorded in private journals, letters, and oral histories, waiting to be discovered by later generations. The Hollis Fontaine case thus became a story not just of disappearance, but of control, fear, and the extraordinary influence of a single person. It was a story that would linger long after the physical evidence had vanished. The unclear position of Celeste Fontaine in the Hollis estate was not by accident. Everyone on the plantation, from the owners to the workers, knew something unusual was happening, but no one wanted to speak openly about it. They all played a part in keeping a story going. A story that let life continue without chaos. From old bank records, church papers, and private letters, we see that the whole community was part of this quiet performance. Plantation owners, merchants, lawyers, priests, and enslaved workers all kept up a pretend reality. To face the truth directly would have caused arguments, legal problems, and possibly violence. Staying silent was easier. After the Civil War, this pretend story didn't disappear. It changed shape. Celeste Fontaine, who had acted as the main controller of the Hollis estate, became the legal owner of the land during the chaos of Reconstruction. The illusion was not broken. It became a new story that the new society could accept. In the 1870 federal census, Celeste appears as Celeste White, listed as a widowed landowner of mixed race. Tax records show that her neighbors were former plantation owners now managing much smaller farms. The story had shifted. She was no longer a white plantation mistress. She was a free woman of color who somehow legally owned property. Strange, but possible in those times. Church records from St. Agnes Parish in Natchez show Celeste White attending regularly and donating from 1868 until her death. There is no mention of Charles or Margaret Hollis or their children, even though they had been well known before. 1841. It was as if they had never existed. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence from her later life is a daguerreotype, an old photograph from about 1876, found in 1952 with a family descended from former slaves nearby. The photo shows an elderly African-descended woman sitting on the porch of a small farmhouse. She is dressed plainly but carries authority and dignity. Notes written with the photograph call her Madam White. She was remembered for knowing herbal medicine and helping both black and white people. The notes do not mention her past. They only say she came into her land after the war and helped newly freed families with small loans, seeds, and livestock. If this woman is indeed Celeste Fontaine in her final life as Celeste White, it shows that she not only survived but reinvented herself, living openly and respected until her death. Though never completely honestly, her journey from enslaved woman to acting plantation master to respected landowner is an extraordinary story of navigating the strict racial and social rules of 19th century Mississippi. Celeste White died on September 12, 1882. Church records say it was from complications of age. Her will, surprisingly detailed for someone who had once been a slave, left her estate to several local families, many of whom had been enslaved. She made no mention of her life before freedom. She was buried in a small cemetery outside Natchez. In 1961, the cemetery was moved for highway construction. Many remains were moved to Oak Grove Memorial Cemetery, but her grave marker, a simple stone reading Celeste White, 1834–1882, at rest, was never recovered. Her final resting place is now unmarked. Since then, the Hollis Fontaine story has mostly stayed on the edges of history. Scholars mention it briefly, but few study it in detail. The reason is clear. It reveals uncomfortable truths about power, race, and the ways communities keep secrets. In the 1960s, historian Dr. Eleanor Fitch tried to write a full study of the case. Publishers rejected it. In her personal journal, she wrote, "The Hollis case is not just an odd story. It reflects our ability to deceive ourselves. We choose comfortable lies over hard truths." Her point is stronger when we see how much physical evidence was destroyed. The Hollis house burned, was rebuilt, and later demolished. The land was divided and built over. Graves were lost or moved. Documents vanished. Even Celeste White's grave was erased. Yet the story survives. It lives in fragments, court notes, unusual census entries, oral memories, and recovered letters. It remains because it tells us something about human societies and the fragile agreements that hold them together. In 1965, during the Federal Writers Project, a woman named Rebecca Turner, 103 years old and born into slavery, was asked about the Hollis plantation. After a long pause, she said, "Some things don't get told straight. They live in what folks don't say. Everybody knew what happened out there. They just decided it was easier not to know." The most disturbing part of the Hollis Fontaine story is not the violence that started it, but how the community responded. They chose to pretend rather than face a reality that threatened their social world. This willingness to ignore what is real shows how fragile our human-made systems are, and how far people will go to protect comfortable illusions. The land where these events happened is now covered by highways, shopping centers, and homes. Thousands pass daily over the ground that once witnessed a dramatic reversal of power. Like the people who ignored Celeste Fontaine taking Margaret Hollis's place, we walk through landscapes shaped by forgotten histories. Some stories, however, refuse to stay buried. They resurface in old photos, notes, and quiet memories. They remind us that the most frightening horrors are not ghosts, but humans, and that the most dangerous lies are the ones we choose to live inside.